Martin Luther King Jr. by Sam Dialocker. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and an activist who fought for African American rights and an end to segregation. He's recognized most for his well-known speech, "I Have a Dream," that he gave in Birmingham, Alabama in spring 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Michael King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was named after his father, also Michael King, who later adopted the name Martin Luther in honor of the German reformer. Michael Jr. would later adopt the name himself. Martin Luther King Jr. skipped 9th and 11th grade and entered Morehouse College in Atlanta at age 15. However, his first 2 years he was an unmotivated student and put forth little effort. Martin Luther's family was very religious and involved in their church. Martin was uncomfortable with religion and questioned it. He was uncomfortable with overly emotional displays of worship at this time in his life. Later, in his junior year of college, he took a Bible class where he began to feel more comfortable with his faith and think about a career in ministry. Martin Luther King Jr. is the most widely known African American of his era. His work has been honored with a national holiday, there are schools and buildings named after him, and there is a memorial in Washington, D.C. honoring him. He was deeply committed to achieving justice for African Americans through nonviolent actions. In 1946, just 2 years after beginning college, King wrote a letter to the Atlanta Constitution that stated that black people are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. King never stopped believing this, and even in 1961 he met with President Kennedy and urged him to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation to eliminate racial segregation. In 1958, during a book signing in Harlem, New York, Martin Luther King was stabbed by Izola Ware Curry. The doctors at a Harlem hospital removed a 7-inch letter opener from his chest. This is the second of 3 attempts to murder King. 2 years earlier, while King was speaking at a mass meeting, his home was bombed, no one was injured, and later King addressed the angry crowd outside his home begging for nonviolence. On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington took place. Here, Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 3 television networks offered live coverage of the march. This was King's formal introduction to the nation. There were almost 250,000 people at the March on Washington that day. Martin Luther King Jr. was rightfully famed for his views on nonviolence to overcome injustice, his passion to end segregation, and his belief that all men are created equal. In 1964, King was the youngest person to receive the Nobel Prize. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested a number of times. On June 11, 1964, King was arrested for demanding service at a whites-only restaurant in St. Augustine, Florida. In total, he was arrested 29 times, once for violating a suspended sentence for a traffic violation, once at a protest in Georgia, and once at a prayer vigil, and more. In October 1963, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy authorized the FBI to wiretap King's landline phone. The next November, King criticized the FBI's failure to protect civil rights workers, and J. Edgar Hoover called King the most notorious liar in the country. In December of 1964, King confronted Hoover at the Justice Department, saying, "I have been seriously misquoted in the matter of slurs against the FBI." Before giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he had his whole speech all planned and written out. It actually had nothing to do with what some would call his trademark, "I have a dream." King's advisor, Wyatt Walker, told him not to use the line he had already worn out. But in the middle of his speech, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson yelled, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," and so he did. Martin Luther King Jr. was very involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus and was then arrested. Activists in Montgomery coordinated a bus boycott and chose King for their leader and spokesperson. Martin Luther King Jr. was very responsible for the passing of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act for African Americans in the 60s. These acts changed African American life dramatically. The Civil Rights Act made African American rights more equal to those of the white citizens of the U.S. The Voting Rights Act made it legal for African Americans to vote in elections. This photo shows King shaking hands with President Johnson at the signing of the Voting Rights Act. King was murdered on April 4, 1968. He was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The shooter, former convict James Earl Ray, was apprehended after a 2-month international manhunt. King's assassination sparked riots in over 100 cities across the U.S. King's killer was sentenced to 99 years in prison in 1969 and died in prison on April 23, 1998. Without Martin Luther King Jr., it is unlikely that the U.S. would be the way it is today. Martin Luther King, without a doubt, played a pivotal role in the ending of legal segregation of African Americans.